Dusty was rubbing trees early in the morning, aiming to handcraft a primitive smoking stove. After much effort, the stove was still unfinished, and the strenuous work left Dusty with a straight back. Suddenly, he returned with a partridge, though he did not record how he caught it. Excited and speaking incoherently, Dusty began processing the partridge, saving the wing feathers for arrow fletching, and then prepared to start a fire for cooking. After slow cooking over a big fire, a fresh pot of chicken and mushroom stew was ready. On day 10, Dusty woke up in his cabin. Breakfast was still partridge soup, but a sour sensation in his stomach soon hit him before he could finish his meal. He quickly found a corner to clear his stomach, but the burning pain persisted. Dusty realized the severity of the situation, which might require hospitalization and surgery if left untreated. Holding a satellite phone, he tearfully expressed his reluctance to leave. Shortly after, the cruise speedboat appeared again on the water. Dusty thought his constipation was caused by wild berries he had eaten. He had promised his wife he would return home safely, and now he preferred to leave on his own, rather than being carried out. At that moment, even a strong man like Dusty cried his eyes out. He was happy to have joined the challenge, and although he did not make it to the end, the thought of reuniting with his family soon swept away his sadness. With Dusty's departure, 7 hungry contestants remained. The weather today was excellent. William stripped naked and took a sunbath on the grass, living a carefree life. Later, he returned to the shelter to prepare a few wild chickens for soup, but was shocked to find the campsite in disarray with feathers everywhere. The wild chickens hidden in the cave were gone, another contestant's supplies stolen. William was furious, thinking that hiding in the rock crevices was the safest choice, but he had underestimated the thieves. Jake had not eaten any protein for a week, but he was not in pain from hunger. He was tired of the taste of berries and urgently needed some fish to nourish his body. However, his fishing net had been empty for days, which drastically lowered his confidence. Suspecting the problem was the terrain, he moved his net to a deeper part of the water, hoping for a quick success in catching fish. Next, it was time to wash his clothes, which he boiled in a large pot. Unfortunately, boiling water splashed onto his hands, scalding them severely, causing numbness, pain, and peeling. Jake was dumbfounded by his own stupidity. To avoid infection, he quickly took out a first aid kit to treat the burns. For the next few days, he had to keep his hand dry, essentially rendering it useless. Given the harsh environmental conditions, Jake knew he couldn't afford any more mistakes and had to be extra cautious in the upcoming challenges. Timber arrived at the riverbank early in the morning. After looking around, he guessed there might be elk tracks across the grassland. Today, Timber planned to weave a fishing net for catching fish. Crafting a homemade fishing net was literally like doing intricate handwork. Today was also his girlfriend's birthday, so he specially made the fishing net as a commemorative gift. With vigorous effort, a new fishing net was quickly created. The sun was about to set, and there was no time to set the net. The remaining time was spent fishing and looking around. Before long, Timber was showing off a big fish in front of the camera. He danced excitedly on camera, but before he could finish celebrating, another line snagged a catch. A large fish, weighing over 10 pounds, was easily reeled in. Overly excited, Timber returned to the shelter where he started having a severe nosebleed. The strong smell of blood could attract nearby black bears, so he was careful not to carelessly discard the leaves used to stop the bleeding. Timber had enough protein, but his shelter was still merely a plastic tarp. He decided to upgrade to a permanent shelter. He went into the woods and began chopping trees. The materials he collected were large logs, which meant he needed a lot of physical strength. First, he set up a tripod with stakes, then he laid the large logs across the top. The process was energy-intensive, but eventually, a simple yet luxurious shelter frame was completed. He finished by making walls with sticks and filling the gaps with moss, providing windshielding and insulation. With such a sturdy shelter, Timber wouldn't have to worry about a blizzard in winter. The challenge reached day 13. Jake's scalded hand severely affected his daily tasks. He had to carefully tend to his injury every day to avoid infection, which would mean failure in his survival challenge. With his hand injured, he could no longer hunt with a bow and arrow, meaning he had to rely on fishing to survive. At the riverbank, he checked his net and found a barracuda waiting, weighing over 10 pounds. To his surprise, there were actually 2.
I am on such a high right now.
Got him.
My net.
Look at that pike.
Seeing the rich protein, Jake decided to make a smoking grill. He built a conical frame with collected sticks and covered it with a thick layer of pine needles. Then he could fire up and cook the fish inside. Starving for days, he craved the juicy, tender protein. This roasted meat was not only delicious and juicy, but also had 5 times the protein content of beef. After this meal, Jake felt confident about winning the championship. Meanwhile, Timber, who was enjoying a meaty feast, seemed to be faring the best in the competition. Not only did he have a luxurious log cabin, but he also had an endless supply of large fish and meat to enjoy. While he was relishing his meal, a strange noise suddenly came from the nearby woods. Timber, an experienced outdoorsman, recognized it immediately as the sound of a grouse. He quickly grabbed his gear to investigate. It flew away, prompting Timber to curse out loud in frustration. He then took his bow and arrow to explore the wilderness further. In the distance, he spotted a moose grazing. Timber approached silently, careful not to startle the animal. He chose to circle around to the riverside to approach from behind. Facing such a massive creature, Timber was nervous. He drew his bow, singing softly as he ran towards his target.
I don't care what the noise does. I don't care how much noise I make.
Upon getting closer, he found the moose lying before him. Excited by the sight of several 100 pounds of protein, Timber felt he had officially taken over the competition. To prevent the protein from rotting, Timber knew he had to skin the moose quickly. He had experience butchering large animals. He quickly removed the hide and set aside the organs for that evening's dinner. Concerned about the scent of blood attracting predators, Timber decided to use local resources to start a fire and process the meat right there. After a long and tiring day, the thought of soon enjoying roasted meat spurred him on. First, he removed the 4 legs of the moose and then cut the remaining meat into smaller pieces. Knowing he couldn't finish all the work before dark, Timber decided to take half back to camp to eat and leave the other half for the next day, hoping it wouldn't be scavenged by wild animals. That evening, Timber made a stew, modestly stating he had only secured a little meat compared to other strong competitors. The challenge had reached day 15. The weather was hot. Michaela's tender feet had turned tough as old jerky. To keep her feet dry, Michaela spread charcoal evenly over them, which effectively absorbed moisture from the skin. After finishing her preparations, she took her bow and arrow to explore the wilderness, first checking the traps she had set around day 10. Unfortunately, the past few days had yielded nothing, and the snares on the ground were empty. As she ventured deeper into the jungle, Michaela quickly spotted a wild grouse in a tree. She drew her bow and aimed, but the grouse dodged the arrow. She quickly readied another shot, but missed again. Now, not only had she failed to catch the grouse, but she also had to spend time looking for her arrows. Back to Timber, who had almost finished processing the moose. Today's task was still to transport the meat back to the shelter. After completing all his tasks, he first ate a piece of moose meat to replenish his strength. If the bloody moose meat was not handled promptly, it could attract wild animals and spoil quickly. Therefore, Timber needed to build a smoking rack. He went to the river to gather mud to use as an adhesive, and then collected materials from around the area to build the smoker. Even though he was exhausted by the effort, the thought of the rich, juicy moose meat at home made it all worthwhile. He couldn't smoke all the meat, and to better preserve the food, Timber could only pray for colder weather soon. Finally, he covered it with thick logs to seal it off. The scene cuts to Jake, who is still sunbathing by the river. Afterward, he heads back into the woods, tired and hunting. Unfortunately, he finds no sign of grouse despite searching for most of the day. However, when he returns to the river, Jake suddenly bursts into strange laughter. It turns out the net has caught 2 big fish. He quickly pulls it up to check. A cod weighing over 10 pounds, with a small salmon still in its mouth. Jake laughs nonstop at this catch. The other fish, a large dogfish, also weighs over 10 pounds. This catch alone provides 2 types of protein. The camera shifts to Dub, who has devoted all his energy to a shelter. He builds a small, robust chimney and covers the roof with weeds and pine needles. Though the shelter is small, it's as sturdy as a fortress. He finishes by laying a waterproof cloth on top and securing it with wood. Once winter arrives, this shelter will be his strongest logistical support, fully equipped inside and meeting all of Dub's basic living conditions. Isayan decides to demonstrate outdoor toothbrushing techniques. Expecting him to use charcoal for cleaning, he instead casually pulls out a toothbrush. His teeth are indeed impressive. Today, his task is to continue building a permanent shelter. Before that, Isayan decides to start with a fireplace. He begins by driving multiple sticks into the ground for stability, then neatly stacking stones around them, filling the gaps with mud. By midday, it becomes clear he's building a cooking stove. With no time left to search for food, Isayan's dinner remains as bleak as the cold wind. At night, strange howls outside scare Isayan, who guesses it might be wolves having a party nearby. Fearing for his life, he knows he must accelerate the construction of his permanent shelter. By morning, Isayan recounts that it was the most terrifying night ever, with wolves howling all night. To escape these fearful days, he starts work early at the construction site. His shelter, using a full wooden frame, requires neatly stacked logs as walls with gaps tightly filled with mud. This type of house is spacious and solid but requires too much material, draining a survivor's energy. Once completed, Isayan's winter will be worry-free, though he wonders if he can last that long without food. Michaela comes back early in the morning with a bird's nest, which, although lacking eggs, serves as excellent kindling. Today she continues to improve her shelter, planning to cut down all nearby branches. Her shelter's entrance faces north, directly welcoming the cold northwest wind in winter. She covers the entrance with branches to block the cold, sacrificing sunlight for warmth and safety, thereby correcting a critical mistake. While working, a sudden scream catches Michaela's attention, leading her to discover a trap has caught a rabbit, a surprising and fortunate catch. The rabbit, weighing over 5 pounds, could provide enough food for a week if rationed. After processing, Michaela discards the innards, leaving only the edible meat. Starving for several days, she decides to indulge herself and starts with a rabbit leg. Some chili powder would make this even better. If there was a meal like this every day, Michaela would easily win the championship. Dub arrived at the riverbank and noticed movement in the water from afar. It was obviously a big fish splashing. Hungry for days, Dub immediately felt energized. He hurried to the riverbank to start fishing. However, the fish seemed to have agreed to ignore Dub's bait. He spent most of the day changing spots but didn't catch even a small fish. Timber was worried that someone might steal the deer meat by the river. He went to check and indeed found a mink nearby. Timber quickly chased it, but it escaped in the end. Upon opening the storage locker, he found the moose heart had been eaten, and the remaining meat was a mess. The first thing to handle was a large chunk of fat. Timber made a huge pot of all-meat stew. The pot was too small. 1,000 pounds of deer meat couldn't possibly be consumed quickly. Thus, the iron pot was almost constantly stewing meat. He feared getting a few pounds heavier. Next, he rendered all the fat from the meat. Timber even made a fat storage container from bark. His creativity was truly impressive. Then, he started processing the moose meat. First, he cut the meat into small pieces, then skewered them on branches to smoke in the smoker. There was so much meat that even the simple task of cutting it exhausted Timber. Finally, with a room full of smoked meat, Timber started a fire inside to smoke it properly. As long as the temperature was controlled, the heat inside would dry out the meat. After everything, he stewed another pot of meat for dinner. Timber's life had reached a peak. Dub was inexplicably excited, playing disco in the shelter, creating a bar-like atmosphere. After the frenzy, he returned to reality and had to go back to fishing. He decided to make an automatic fishing device using the traditional L7 latch principle. Simply set, the device would trigger instantly. Dub had learned fishing since childhood, so he was skilled with such traps. Finally, he tied the fishing line and connected it to a ground trigger. The automatic fishing device was ready, and even before he left, a nearby semi-automatic hook caught a fish. A several-pound shad was easily caught. Dub decided to process the fish on the spot. Meanwhile, the automatic device signaled another catch. A 5-pound dogfish was easily secured. Fortunes change, and this time, it had turned to Dub. The camera shifted to Michaela. She had intended to take a walk by the river, but unexpectedly spotted a group of wild geese swimming. If not for the distance, the hungry Michaela would have rushed to bite them. With no choice left, she continued to drink plain water. Noticing many squirrel tracks around, Michaela decided to set traps. But before she could start, an impulse to quit surged. Mikola felt an unprecedented loneliness. Rather than food, she craved companionship. She spoke a lot to the camera, essentially finding reasons to quit. Her previously set duck trap hadn't caught anything, but the river net surprisingly caught a large dogfish. However, her mind was set on quitting, and she ended up releasing the fish. If you're not serious, don't compete. Do you know how many desperately want this opportunity? People are like that. Once their resolve wavers, they find reasons to give up. After much consideration, Mikola still pulled out her phone and announced her withdrawal. She realized how precious family companionship was only after arriving here. Now, she urgently wanted to go home and reunite with her family. If she couldn't endure it, leaving early might be the right choice. The challenge has reached day 19 with 6 contestants remaining. After 2 days of smoking and roasting, Timber's barbecue is freshly served. To preserve it properly, the smoked venison is stored back in the cabinet. Despite living a laid-back life, Timber maintains his personal hygiene and decides to shave today. Using a sharp arrowhead, he shaves his face messily, resulting in an instant charm boost. Next, Timber plans to build a bed for the shelter. He starts with a venison stew before collecting materials outdoors. The bed, a survival essential, will feature a natural wooden structure with large logs as the headboard base and smaller logs neatly arranged on the ground as the bed base. However, before he can finish, Timber feels an overwhelming sense of fatigue and suspects a health issue as he sweats profusely and feels extremely cold, suspecting an alternating fever. He intends to eat some venison to calm his nerves, but suddenly feels worse. Dub starts his day with a self-organized auction, pricing everything in sight. Whoever buys this magical piece of wood will pay $42. After the auction, he immediately switches to working mode. As he walks outdoors, Dub notices a significant drop in temperature. He worries about the river freezing in winter, making it hard to fish for food, so he hurries to fish and store protein for the winter. At the river, he finds his net full of garbage instead of fish. With no time to wait, Dub opts to fish. Despite preferring hunting, time constraints force him to stick with fishing. Suddenly, the fishing rod jerks, and the fish, larger than expected, nearly drags him into the river. He manages to pull in a huge salmon, excitingly showcasing it on camera.
How's that? No.
But then things take an unexpected turn. Frustrated, Dub is left speechless and has no choice but to start over. Meanwhile, Jake combats boredom by engaging in handicrafts. He carves something and bakes it at high temperatures in the fire, only realizing it's a pipe. He takes a puff to satisfy his craving. His task today is to continue enhancing the shelter. He begins by vigorously logging in the forest, aiming to build a conical permanent shelter. He constructs a conical frame from logs and covers it with pine and spruce leaves for roofing, which provides shelter from the elements and insulation. After finishing, he checks his fishing line as usual, but sees no catch from afar. Jake uses his last bait, replacing the fishing line with the toughest shoelace to prevent barracudas from biting through. However, within minutes, a fish bites but escapes, causing Jake immense frustration and a spike in blood pressure. Worse, the line breaks, forcing him to remove his shoes and enter the near-freezing water to retrieve the hook. This chills him to the core, but he eventually recovers the hook and line. Due to the cold, he hurries back to the shelter to warm up by the fire. Jake says he eats almost 30 pounds of food every day, but he hasn't had a bowel movement for the past 12 days. He realizes there might be a problem with his digestive system and wonders how much longer he can endure. Thinking of his children at home, Jake knows he can't give up easily. On day 20, William starts his day by fishing in the river. He planned to catch just one fish, but ended up trying to fish the river empty. Maybe he got addicted to chewing bark. Despite having fish, he still chews bark to satisfy his hunger. After breakfast, he searches for berries nearby, not caring if they are poisonous. He eats them without looking. He then spots a raccoon and comments on its cuteness. However, upon returning to the shelter, he is shocked to find that the fish meat hung up has been gnawed to the bones. Frustrated by the heartlessness of the wildlife, he has no choice but to go back to fishing. At the riverbank, a large carp, weighing about 5 pounds, awaits. William skillfully processes the fish, cutting it into 2 pieces to take back. Learning from the theft, he is extra cautious with storing food and hangs the bag with fish in a tree, considering it the safest place he can think of. It's already starting to snow outside. Meanwhile, Jake receives a notification for a medical checkup. He has been feeling increasing abdominal pain due to not having defecated for days. He worries the medical team might disqualify him from the competition after their examination. The next moment, the production crew's boat appears on the river, bringing everyone their first physical checkup. They start with a weight check followed by individual consultations. Timber shares that he sometimes has abdominal pain and hasn't had a bowel movement in a week. Jake has the same issue but hasn't had a bowel movement in almost half a month. After a thorough examination, doctors suspect Jake has an intestinal obstruction. For safety, he needs professional treatment. Upon hearing the news, Jake immediately breaks down in tears, unable to express his feelings. Life is unpredictable. Health comes before everything else. Jake has proven his strength through his actions in the past. Although he didn't win, he has no regrets. With Jake's departure, only 5 contestants remain. Saran plans to make a serial fishing rig, tying 6 hooks to a fishing line. Maybe she believes more hooks will catch more fish. After organizing her shelter, she explores the wilderness, but finds nothing. Later, she spots a grouse in a tree but misses her shot and ends up being mocked by the grouse. Checking her fishing line in the river, the deadly cereal hooks yield no catch. Feeling empty inside, Saran momentarily considers quitting, but the substantial prize money motivates her to keep going. Isaiah has been busy building a shelter these past few days. His house is now taking shape. Despite his hunger-weary body, living in this wilderness mansion feels worth it to him. At the river, instead of fishing, he washes the underwear he's worn for a month. Isaiah hasn't eaten in days and starts feeling dizzy. He quickly boils water to calm his nerves. Birch bark, rich in oils, makes excellent tinder. A few strikes of flint are all it takes to start a fire. After finishing his tasks, Isaiah explores the jungle but finds nothing. He stumbles upon a tangled fishing net. With this, he can fish. Now he must spend a lot of time repairing the net, a task that tests his patience. Meanwhile, Dub's shelter is noisy early in the morning because he accidentally broke his glasses. Now the lenses fall out with the slightest touch. Using heated pine resin as glue, Dub tries to fix the frames, but it's not easy. Eventually, he uses rope to forcefully fix them. His glasses are repaired, flawed, but functional. Saran has been losing hair rapidly lately, fearing baldness by the end of the competition. She suspects it's due to poor nutrition. Exhausted, she sunbathes by the river and suddenly shows off 2 grouse she caught, having cleaned them on the spot. Back to Isaiah, he slept well last night and feels much better today. He checks his fishing line but catches nothing. He spends time mending a net full of holes, unsure if it will catch any fish. After chopping down a spruce tree, the effort leaves him extremely tired. His stomach hurts, his heart races, and prolonged hunger and loneliness have drained him. Severe chest pain forces him to stop and sit by the shore. Deep breathing doesn't help. He doesn't want to give up. Remembering his deceased brother, he asks for advice aloud. As geese fly overhead, Isaiah takes it as a sign from his brother. He then uses a satellite phone to quit the competition, tearfully explaining that the southward flight of the geese symbolizes returning home. With his departure, 4 hungry competitors remain. Timber's area turns out to be a prime spot. He hasn't even finished the moose meat from a few days ago when he spots a moose family in the swamp. Luckily, he has achieved barbecue freedom. After several days of rest, Timber has recovered from his earlier weakness. The smell of the smoked meat has mostly dissipated. His shelter has a bed made of spruce branches, more comfortable than a luxury mattress. Just as things seem to improve, an accident happens. While sawing wood for fire, he cuts his finger. Fortunately, the injury is minor. Timber uses spruce resin to seal the wound, preventing blood loss and infection. This incident doesn't stop him from competing for the $500,000 prize, but it somewhat shakes his confidence. Timber's survival skills are strong, but loneliness becomes his greatest enemy in this challenge. William arrived early in the wilderness to look for berries. Winter is approaching quickly here. Soon, these easily accessible resources will be gone. Today, he was exceptionally lucky and stumbled upon an old plastic can. Later, he checked the fishing nets by the river. It seems all his luck went into finding that can, as the nets caught no fish at all. Nevertheless, there's no need to worry. There's still some fish left from a few days ago at home, perfect for tonight's dinner. To secure more food sources, he set several traps along the way home, preparing for the upcoming harsh winter. It's always good to have extra food stored. Once back at the shelter, he made a fish head soup to stave off hunger. After this meal, he'll face hunger again for the next 3 days. It's day 24. Dub's shelter was smoking early in the morning. It was drizzling outside, but Dub was unaffected indoors. Now he needs to check the fishing nets at the river, his daily task regardless of the weather. A large fish had been waiting in the net for a long time. Learning from his previous mistake, Dub didn't show off this time. Instead, he knocked the fish dead with a stick immediately. This fish weighed over 10 kilograms and measured more than a meter long. With this catch, Dub won't have to worry about food for the next 3 days. To ensure food supply for the winter, Dub planned to smoke some of the protein. He processed the fish right by the river, then cut it up with his knife. He had already prepared a smoking grill. He placed the sliced fish on it, covered the fish head with pine needles, and set a fire underneath. The high heat slowly dried the meat. Smoking meat is a lengthy process. To enjoy roasted meat, Dub stayed by the grill until dark. The fish wasn't very fatty, barely enough to sustain him. To survive longer, Dub needed to secure more red meat and fat. He intended to fetch water for fish soup, but became alert as soon as he stepped outside. Across the lake, a moose was grazing. Seeing this, he immediately mimicked a moose call. The called moose twirled its hips and left the next second. Now, Dub had to approach quietly without being spotted, using nearby cover. The handheld camera was cumbersome, so he left it and only took the action camera. But the moose wasn't naive and ran away as soon as it sensed the hunter. With the sunset, Dub had to return to the shelter to rest. Whether he can hunt again must be planned for another day. It was nighttime. Although Timber had harvested thousands of pounds of moose meat, granting him protein independence, his situation was far from comfortable. A large pack of wolves had appeared around his shelter, circling nearby every night. Now he was terrified even to step outside for a nocturnal bathroom break. He hadn't slept well for several nights. This morning he found many wolf tracks near his camp, indicating they had noticed his presence. Timber worried the wolves might steal his food, so he went to check the site where he had butchered the moose to see if any remains were still there. Due to the lingering danger, Timber had to keep his bow and arrows with him at all times. The riverbank was eerily quiet. Halfway there, he spotted the large paw prints of a gray bear. Timber, bristling with fear, followed the tracks and reached the site where he had hunted the elk. He found that all the remains and viscera had disappeared. Timber was incredibly surprised. He realized that it was not safe to stay and had to leave this dangerous place immediately. To assert his territory, Timber ran and urinated along the way to mark his territory, hoping the smell would deter the surrounding wildlife. The challenge had reached day 26. Since encountering the elk yesterday, Dub vowed to catch one for a hot pot meal. He followed the animal paths nearby. The area was unusually quiet. Knowing that elk are fond of lakes and marshes, Dub went to the riverbank and mimicked the call of a doe. His throat was almost smoking by the end, but he found nothing. He decided to go back and fish honestly, or else if he couldn't catch elk, he'd run out of fish too. With winter approaching, he would have to return home to a warm bed. So, he returned to his shelter with his bow and arrows. But just as he was about to go fishing, he heard some birds calling from a nearby tree. Dub took out his bow and arrow and followed the sound, and sure enough, he discovered a wild grouse in the tree. A single shot struck soulfully. Dub went up and twisted its neck to finish it off. Saran, who had been half dead, felt fully revived and confident after catching 2 grouses. Lately, she'd been busy perfecting her shelter. When tired or sleepy, she would rest, and when hungry, she would eat chicken and drink chicken soup. Life was quite comfortable and pleasant, but the chicken meat wouldn't last many days, so to continue surviving, she needed to store more protein soon. Over many days, she began to doubt his hunting skills, as she hadn't successfully hunted anything but wild grouse so far. She returned to the riverbank to harvest wild grass, hoping to make flour from the seeds to stave off hunger. First, she separated the seeds from the weeds, then ground them into fine flour and cooked it. This seemed like a sensible plan. Saran said she could survive on flour even if the production team went bankrupt. After a busy half-day, she made a small block of flour, fried it in a pan until golden brown on both sides, and it tasted almost like bread, though it was a bit rough on the throat. Now, even without protein, Saran could survive on these seeds for a while. William had also been busy building a shelter, which was now essentially complete. The geese flying south in the sky indicated that not much time was left before winter. Except for him, the other contestants were already eating meat, so today's top priority was to find food. William made a lure with wire and rope, planning to fish for shad in the river. He also had to hand-make a fishing rod with 2 hooks attached, hoping to greatly increase his chances of success. He went to the riverbank and immediately started fishing. As a 10-year veteran fisherman, he was used to life away from home. Just when he thought he would return empty-handed again today, a shad took the bait. After a final maneuver, he successfully landed it. Dinner was secured for the day. He cleaned the fish by the riverbank and hung the remaining meat in a tree to save for tomorrow. Saran reminisced about the Chinese dishes he once enjoyed, particularly the ones so spicy they caused a burning sensation. To satisfy his craving for Chinese-style game, he laid a trap network in the surrounding area, aiming to catch every squirrel in sight. He also went to the riverbank to locate beaver trails, where he planned to set numerous traps. Although Saran is a vegetarian, his hunger drove him to desperately seek meat. In his words, whether or not to eat meat depends on his mood. Early in the morning, Dub was processing grouse. The bird's blood contains many trace elements, making stewing it the best option. While the soup simmered, Dub planned to walk to the river to retrieve his lost bow and arrows. He quickly spotted an arrowhead in the water. Directly retrieving it was too risky due to the icy mud on the bank, so he tied a log with a rope and threw it into the water, hoping to hook the arrowhead back. After some effort, he successfully retrieved it. Back at the shelter, the chicken was well stewed, but just as Dub was about to enjoy his meal, he heard howling in the distance. Several white wolves were eyeing him menacingly. This scared Dub so much that he lost his appetite. Fortunately, the wolves just looked and left. Shivering, Dub returned to the shelter and nervously tasted the chicken soup. Hunger being the best spice, even boiled chicken tasted like a 5-star hotel meal to Dub.